PowerPoint. The format for this meeting is Dr. Lynn is going to make a presentation, and we have loaded a PowerPoint for him. If it's okay with Dr. Wing, perhaps during his presentation, but certainly afterwards, if the board has any questions or points he wants to make or conversation, that's the appropriate time to do it. Consistent with the way the board conducted the other expert field briefing that y'all had, the dialogue this morning will be between the board members and Dr. Wing. The time that has been allotted for this meeting is 2 hours from 10 to 12. If, however, people want to stick around after that, the room is yours. You certainly are consistent with Dr. Wing's schedule. You can linger and ask whatever questions or discussion that you might have. So, without any further ado, let me welcome Dr. Wing, who was gracious enough to join us this morning on very short notice, and we appreciate you doing that. So, Dr. Wing.
Thank you, Bob. It's really a pleasure to be here. We work very hard on research over at the university, and it's really an honor to be able to come to talk to you about that. It's great. We really appreciate your interest. I want to begin by talking to you a little bit about my field, epidemiology and public health, just so that you could understand a little bit about where I'm coming from. Back in the 1800s, a lot was not known about how the environment affects health. If you think back to the middle 1800s here in the United States, there were epidemics of infectious diseases that affected especially urban areas, but also rural areas. And at that time, it wasn't known why these epidemics would happen. But as epidemiology, the field I work in, came onto the scene, it was discovered that, for example, contamination of water supplies caused many of the diseases that people died from at that time, these epidemics. So epidemiology, the word originates, it comes from the meaning, the study of epidemics. And that's what we did for a long time. And epidemiologists showed that if you moved the intake for water supplies upstream from where sewage wastes were sent into rivers, that you would be able to reduce the occurrence of these epidemics. Or if we were to drain swamps where mosquitoes breed that spread disease, that we would be able to reduce the epidemics. And in the 20th century, epidemiology moved as many of these infectious disease epidemics began to decline. My field moved away, although we still study infectious diseases. We also moved to look at other causes of disease, which were really mysterious 100 years ago. There was very little understanding of why people would get cancer or heart disease or lung diseases or why infants would die. But now, through systematic research, a lot has been learned, and we now have long lists of chemicals and physical agents, things in the environment that we know are the causes of disease. And this has been learned to some degree through laboratory studies of animals or cells, but also through large studies of people. And this is how we understand now about many cancer-causing chemicals, and also about air pollution. For example, gases and particles that are in the air and that can advance disease and cause people to be hospitalized or to die. And so this is the kind of work that I've been involved in as an epidemiologist, and this is the kind of work we do in our field. So it was about 15 years ago or so, a little bit more, that I became aware of public health issues in the production of livestock. And let me put this in context. In the first half of the 20th century, really up through around 50 years ago, most of our meat and milk and eggs were produced by small farmers. I'm sure that you know that. And there's been a very rapid transition from smaller family farms to industrialized production. And this has brought with it problems in the workplace and problems in the environment, meaning for communities that are affected nearby, that didn't exist before. It's not that the production didn't exist before. There were millions of farmers producing our food supply 50 years ago. And now our food supply is mostly coming from people who are working under contract to very large corporations. And their facilities, they're a very small number of facilities now compared to what there were. And each one has a very large number of animals. So we have concentration which is occurring. And I'm going to share with you a picture. Can you tell me which is at the top? 12 o'clock or 3 o'clock? 3 o'clock, yeah. Let's see. But we don't have the pictures here. Wow. So on the upper left, this is a map of the United States that shows poultry production in 1949. And the dots are all over, and each dot, I can't actually read it from here, I believe, 50,000 chickens.
740, yeah, 50,000.
And then on this map, what we see here is each dot represents 740,000 chickens. And the dots are not all over the map like they were in 1949. So this is 1991. And this concentration has continued since this time. So now poultry production is primarily in the South, from Arkansas through Mississippi, up into the Carolinas, and up through Maryland. So that's a big change from what we had 50 or 60 years ago. Now there are a lot of things have happened with that change. And what I want to talk with you about in part, because I've been asked to be here to talk about the potential impacts of bringing a large poultry processing plant to Nash County. And one of those impacts that is very important to consider is that in order to supply this slaughterhouse, there will need to be new industrial poultry production facilities built, the growing facilities. These are called confined animal feeding operations, which I imagine we've all seen large confinements with large numbers of animals in them, where the waste is taken out and usually it's applied to nearby fields. Although if we have time later, please remind me if you're interested to discuss the 2007 act that was passed by the North Carolina General Assembly, which required our major power producers to use poultry waste for incineration. And that's another possible outcome here, is that some or potentially much of the new waste could go into incinerators if they are built here in North Carolina, which has, and that practice, which is actually dirtier than coal, has real public health implications. So these poultry production facilities are depicted in this picture here, which comes from my colleague Ellen Silvergeld, who's at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in Baltimore. And the picture is actually very relevant to our situation here in North Carolina. It shows a poultry operation here in the middle, a poultry confinement building. And it also shows a hog operation. And I believe is are labeled CAFOs. That's how we pronounce the acronym, Confined Animal Feeding Operation. And it's relevant here in North Carolina because in this part of the state and north and south of here and east of here, there are a large number of hog confinements as well. And you'll see why that's important in just a few minutes. So at the top of the picture, there's a truck in this cartoon drawing. You see a truck. And there's depicted a vehicle riding behind the truck, a car. And the reason that the Johns Hopkins researchers put this in the picture is because they conducted an experiment in Maryland on the roads leading to the poultry processing plant there. They followed the trucks that carry the birds to the processing plants because they were interested in what comes out of the trucks on the highways, on the roads leading to this plant. And their interests come from one of the practices that's used in poultry production routinely now, which is to add low levels of antibiotics to the diet of the birds. Now, this isn't done to treat disease. So that's a different practice, which is part of veterinary medicine when you have sick animals and they need to be treated. You give them antibiotics to kill off the infection. The practice that is now common is to put low levels of antibiotics into either the food or the water of the birds. And actually this is also done with swine. And this promotes the growth of the animals, so they get to market quicker. It's why otherwise the growers wouldn't spend the money, the extra money, to add these antibiotics to the feed. Now, using antibiotics as a growth promoter is a practice that leads to the development of what's called antibiotic resistance. And this happens because the bacteria that can be killed off by these lower levels of antibiotics, they die. And they don't leave offspring. Whereas the ones that are resistant become more prevalent in the population of bacteria. And actually, it's now known that they have particular genes that confer resistance to these antibiotics. And those genes pass from generation to generation of bacteria. As well, there's another phenomenon that's now clearly described, which is that bacteria that have these genes that confer resistance to the antibiotics can pass those genes to other bacteria, other types of bacteria. So the researchers driving this vehicle behind the trucks, they were very interested to find out whether they could detect the bacteria that develop resistance to these antibiotics behind the trucks. If you've ever driven behind a poultry transport truck, you know the feathers and dander and material from the poultry, dusts from the waste and so on, can blow out of the trucks because the cages are open. The trucks are not closed entirely. And the researchers did several things to look for this bacteria. They had air samplers that they ran in the vehicle. They took swipes from the handles of the doors. And they also placed a drink can in the cup holder between the front seats. And they isolated from all of these locations antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The antibiotics that the bacteria were resistant to correspond to the ones that are added into the feed of the birds. Now, why is this important? The main concern for us is that if we develop an infection that is caused by bacteria that have developed this resistance, we go to the hospital, we are put on antibiotics to treat the infection. These antibiotics used to work for us to treat an infection, but increasingly the antibiotics are becoming ineffective because of the development of resistance. And the types of antibiotics used to promote growth in poultry are the same classes of antibiotics that are used to treat infection or immune treatment. So throughout the country and really throughout the world, antibiotic resistance is increasingly becoming a problem. Estimates are that something like 70% of the antibiotics consumed every year in the United States are fed to animals. Only a minority of the antibiotics used every year in our country are actually taken by people. So it's become a routine part of animal production. My professional society, the American Association for Public Health, as well as the American Medical Association and other professional groups have taken the position that this should not be permitted anymore. And really, the way to think about it, you might think, well, a business should have a right to use any materials it wants to produce its product. But if those materials hurt other people, it becomes a problem. So if, for example, if the water supply of Nashville were threatened by a business that put a pollutant, if it put people into the water supply, your responsibility and the responsibility of other public officials would be to do something about it. And here we have a problem which is spreading around, it has already spread around the country in places in particular, such as that are shown in the map that we just saw, but also around the world. And it has to do with a new production practice. This was not part of producing birds in 1949 when that first map represented. It's developed as part of this industrial system to speed the time of the animals to slaughter. And the residues of the antibiotics, as well as the antibiotic-resistant bacteria, have been found in groundwater and surface water, and to be present in the workers in these facilities. So, as they move out of the production facilities, we can have a problem when people become infected. It's also the antibiotic resistance is also potentially a problem in consumer products, because resistant bacteria have also been found in the packages of meat that are distributed from processing plants that process animals that have been grown with these antibiotics. So this is one issue that doesn't actually come from the processing plant, the slaughterhouse itself. It comes from the facilities that would be required to supply the slaughterhouse, and it would be built close enough to the slaughterhouse so that the transportation wouldn't be too expensive. The slaughterhouses are, the confined growing facilities, confined animal feeding operations, such as the ones you put here, they don't require a large number of workers because they're fairly automated, and this is part of the cost savings compared to a farm, a family farm or a local farm. There's a lot less labor required because of automation in feeding and watering and the very large scale of this practice. Inside the confinement buildings, there are problems of worker health. And this is important for several reasons. Workers whose jobs make them sick or injure them can't be as productive members of society as before their health was impaired. So one of the issues to consider in the confinements is that there are a number of respiratory conditions that workers in these growing facilities tend to contract. And this is because in the air in the confinements, there are allergens and there are irritants. One noteworthy one is called endotoxin, which comes from the decaying bacteria, the dead bacteria. And there are lots of fine particles that come from feathers and dander and dried manure. And the gases that are present include ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. And the medical consequences of breathing in these kinds of pollutants for long periods of time over work days include occupational asthma, organic dust toxic syndrome, which is a flu-like syndrome that occurs in workers who breathe a lot of this organic dust. Bacterial diseases and viral diseases, and these would include staph infection. Staph is one of the most important antibiotic-resistant organisms now, and Campylobacter, which is a cause of neurological disease, as well as influenza. So these are issues to consider in the workplace, and there's not a lot of protections for workers in these environments. These are not privileged workers. Some of the occupational health studies that we do at UNC, we work with employers that have a medical department. They have industrial hygiene departments that are designed to protect their workers from physical hazards or from biological or chemical hazards. And that's not true in these confined animal feeding operations, these poultry production facilities. We also want to talk about community health around in the neighborhoods where these facilities are located. And in the picture here, we see that the buildings have to be ventilated. Now, I mentioned before the study of the transport trucks with the cars going behind. So this is just one fact to remember when you're thinking about these transport trucks. They're also shown in this picture flies and small birds. And they're in this picture because in another study around the poultry production facilities in Maryland, conducted at Johns Hopkins, the researchers did something that they told me was very difficult. They figured out how to wash flies' feet. Now, I've never tried to wash a fly's foot before, but they went in their laboratories and they figured out a way to actually isolate the material from the feet of flies. And they were interested in this because, as we all know, flies are attracted to manure. But flies don't stay in one place. They fly all around. And if you talk to people or if you visit neighborhoods that are nearby these facilities that produce very large quantities of manure, you will find out that one of the observations people make is that there are very large numbers of flies that are around the homes. Now, once the researchers at Johns Hopkins figured out how to wash the flies' feet, then they looked at the bacteria that are carried on the feet of the fly. If the fly is feeding, it lands on the manure. The manure has the bacteria that have come out of the birds. And sure enough, they found that the flies' feet are carrying the bacteria that have this antibiotic resistance that develops when the animals are fed low levels of antibiotics. And remember, if you're prescribed an antibiotic by your physician, you're always told, take the entire prescription. If you start feeling better, don't stop early. You need to take the whole prescription. And the reason is because that helps prevent the development of antibiotic resistance, because then all the bacteria will be killed off. If you stop early, the ones that are resistant will be left. Those are the ones, the hardiest bacteria will be left, and they can go on to cause more problems. So the spreading of antibiotic-resistant bacteria is one of the concerns which can occur from flies or birds. Also, the antibiotic-resistant bacteria have been isolated in the air. So the buildings are ventilated and the dusts are coming out. Some of the dusts have bacteria on them. And so it's already known that they don't stay in the building. So this is something which is about which there's active research now. Excuse me. And there are many schools around the country that are continuing these studies. But it's clear that they don't stay in these buildings. Another practice which is important to recognize in producing poultry in the facilities that would be built if the processing plant is brought here is that poultry is routinely now produced using arsenic. Now, we know arsenic as a poison, and it can kill you if you have enough of it. But that rarely happens, and that's not a concern here. What's a concern here are the low levels of arsenic. So arsenic is another growth promoter. That's why it's used in poultry production. But in the last 20 to 30 years, it's become very clear that low levels of arsenic, when ingested or inhaled by people, cause cancer. We get cancer from low levels of arsenic. And including, for example, one thing that surprised epidemiologists never thought, that if you drank something, it could cause lung cancer. But it's now very clear that people who drink water, and this is from naturally occurring arsenic that's in the ground, when they're drinking water that's been through rocks that have arsenic. And the concentrations are low. This is not causing them to become sick right away. It's not an acute toxin. But over time, people exposed to arsenic through drinking water develop lung cancer, also bladder cancer. So one of the things to think about is that the facilities that would come to supply this processing plant will be bringing arsenic to this part of North Carolina. And the arsenic won't stay in the birds. The arsenic comes out of the waste. It's spread onto farmland. And the long-term consequences of this are not well understood, but I can tell you, I live in a rural area. There are farms around my home, my family's home, and I certainly would not want arsenic to be added to our fields in our area. I just think it's a bad idea. And there are many proposals that are up, and include Maryland, which produces a lot of poultry. The legislature there just passed a law to make it more difficult to use arsenic or to prohibit it in poultry production. We don't have that here. Arsenic is still permitted for growing poultry. And it's an important problem. It's something that I believe you should know about in making your decision. Let's talk a little bit about the air pollutants that are coming out of these confined animal feeding operations. They're the same things that are inside that I mentioned before come out of the buildings. So they would be these allergens and irritants, gases like ammonia. In particular, ammonia is a problem with poultry. And there are a lot of other gases that are present in low concentrations, many of them called volatile organic compounds, that give poultry waste its distinctive odor. So you can recognize, for example, poultry waste versus hog waste versus cattle waste. They come from specific gases, these odors that we notice. But there are also fine particles, and these are particles, they're very fine dusts that actually go all the way deep into the lungs, and they can cause respiratory problems. And it's one of the reasons why we, as in public health, have worked so hard to try and reduce the particles that are emitted from, say, coal plants, because it's become clear, or vehicles, it's become clear that they actually can lead to increases in hospitalization and deaths, and not everyone, but people who are sensitive. And this is something which I want to make very clear, because it can be it can be a problem with the message that we give in epidemiology and public health. Is that not every one of us is the same. Say, two of us might go into a classroom in school where the children have respiratory infection, and I might pick up that infection and you wouldn't. So it wasn't dangerous to you. You had more resistance, but it made me sick. And the same thing is true for these fine particles and exposure to the gases and endotoxins or other materials that are present in these facilities. Some people are more sensitive than others. And so it's not, I'm not saying that it's going to make everybody sick. It's not. But it will make some people sick. And that's really been shown. Now, there are fewer studies of poultry facilities than there are of hog growing facilities. The studies that we've done at UNC have primarily focused on hog growing facilities. Let's see, I'm talking here without advancing my 3 o'clock. And I do want to talk a little bit about a study that we did between 2003 and 2005 in eastern North Carolina. So very relevant to this area. And in this study, we enrolled about 100 people who were followed, each of them for about 2 weeks. And they were all non-smokers. We didn't want to have to deal with that as a potential factor. They're non-smokers. And they lived in 16 different neighborhoods in eastern North Carolina. And we supplied each of them a diary where they could record their symptoms every day. And in addition to that, they measured their lung function using a meter that looks like what you may have seen asthmatics sometimes use to check their lung function. And they measured their blood pressure twice a day. And while they did this, we monitored the air pollutants in their neighborhoods. And so this was a study, this was not a study that could possibly have found anything about chronic diseases like heart disease or cancer or anything like this. This is a study of acute health effects and also of quality of life and how the pollutants affected the neighbors. So this photograph here shows the air pollution monitoring trailer that we put together. And there were several machines in this trailer that could detect air pollutants that come from these confined animal growing facilities. We measured hydrogen sulfide. We measured the fine particles that can go into people's lungs. We also evaluated the wind direction and wind speed so we could try to understand what were the weather conditions that would cause people to be exposed. And I don't know how well you can see this. I know I can't see it very well. But this is just a satellite image. It's an aerial photo, you could say, of a part of eastern North Carolina. I'm going to have to go here by memory, but there are several poultry operations shown in this photograph. I know there's one in the lower right, and there's one, I believe, up towards the left corner, and there are also a number of hog confinements. And you can tell the difference because the swine operations all have lagoons beside them. So they're the ones with the rectangular shaped ponds, and these are the manure pits. The poultry waste, of course, is spread as dry litter on the fields. And so we would pick a neighborhood like this, We enroll people. If you look very carefully in the middle of the photograph, a little below the center line, you can see some yellow squares that are meant to indicate example homes of the people, and a red square where that monitoring trailer was put. So what we did was we followed the air pollutants in the neighborhood over time, and they went up and down during this 2-week period. And meanwhile, people are reporting on their symptoms and their on the odors they notice, and they're measuring their blood pressure and their lung function. And what did we find? Well, we've now reported quite a few of these findings in the scientific journals. Very clear that when the air pollution levels go up, people have increased irritation of their eyes, nose, and throat. They experience respiratory conditions like cough and runny nose. Some of them, not as many, actually get nauseous when these odorant pollutants, the pollutants that smell very bad, are in their neighborhood. Their stress levels go up, and then they go back down when the pollutants are gone. Their anxiety levels go up. And in a new study that I expect to be coming out this fall, we showed that they experience increases in their blood pressure. So when the pollutants are present, their blood pressure goes up a little bit. And this is not an area of the country where we need to be exposing people to things that increase their blood pressure. Because we know high blood pressure is a problem in this area. For the last, starting many decades ago, this part of North Carolina has been referred to as the stroke belt because of high death rates for stroke, which is one of the primary outcomes of high blood pressure. And then last in this list here, activities of daily living. And this is one of the things that is most important to people in rural areas. They want to be able to tend their gardens, their animals, they want to be able to take walks, they want to hang their clothes out on the line. And these are activities which people, when they checked off in their diaries, they were less able to do these things when the pollution levels were high. And I note at the bottom, this is a study of the swine confinements, the hog operations, but many of the dusts and the chemicals that are present in swine manure are also present in poultry manure. We have not done studies of poultry operations, so I cannot give you the same kind of information that's directly relevant to poultry operations. But I can tell you that in many ways they're similar. They're large buildings with large numbers of animals that develop these kinds of compounds as a function of the waste that is present. After we did this study, there were some anthropologists who helped us by conducting interviews with people, both who had participated and other neighbors of these confined animal feeding operations. And they talked at great length about that they no longer feel they can have guests or cookouts or family reunions. They can't play outside, garden, work outside. The unpredictability of the odor was a real problem for them because they couldn't plan their activities. They were concerned about property devaluation, which is not only affecting the owner, but over time could affect the tax receipts of the county. These are often low-income people who didn't have an air conditioner or a clothes dryer, but they had to buy those things and pay the electric bills because they could no longer open their windows or dry their clothes outside. And they had difficulty sleeping. because of the odors that came from these facilities. Now, again, these were hog facilities, but I have heard in discussions with rural people, I have even heard some people say that poultry facilities in their neighborhood, they think smell worse than the swine facilities. I can't say that independently, but I have heard that opinion. But certainly it does affect many residents in these areas. And finally, just a few actual quotes here. I think people's experience is relevant. I would really encourage you to talk with people who live close by. But these are some of the quotations. I'm sorry, I can't read them from here. My eyes are too old to be able to read these. But oh, great, yeah, okay, that's better. So they say the odor is sickening. It gets in a house, in a car. I'm self-conscious, angry. I had a garden. Do you see that? Those weeds there? I haven't done it in the past few years. We can't go outside, such disgusting odor. And the photograph here is actually of the yard of the woman who gave us this picture. That's her lawn tractor there. And they're spraying animal waste across the way. And these are the kinds of observations that could come from people who live where they broadcast the poultry dry living, which is also a nuisance odor. So these are community health issues that are related to the production facilities that would come to supply the slaughterhouse. So I'd like to go on to talk a little bit about the slaughterhouse itself. And it's my opinion, from what I have read, in part, I want to thank Mr. Murphy for sending me the county's information sheet on the proposed facility, where I learned more than I had known before about exactly what is planned for this processing plant. It's my opinion that the processing plant will have fewer environmental problems and impacts on community health than the poultry growing facilities that will come along with it, if it's operated properly. And I don't think it's absent of concern. I think there are concerns, and I believe that it will require careful monitoring to make sure everything is done well. I don't think there's as much potential for problem if everything is handled right in a processing plant as there is in the 100 or so chicken houses, or chicken operations, really, because each one could have several houses, that's right, that would come along with it. However, I really think it's important to think about the kinds of jobs, because I know, especially in the economy we're in, jobs is a key issue. I mean, we all need jobs and good work to be able to feed our families and support the kind of life that we want to live. And I'll just tell you as an aside, I'm here, I was born in Louisiana, but I'm here in North Carolina because my father came here for a job in the 1960s. And so I went to school here, and I've been here. So, I mean, I feel like in my family, I understand jobs are really important. We need to have jobs, and good jobs. And this is where this poultry processing environment, there is a lot of evidence that's been assembled over the years that I think should be a cause of concern. This is very physically demanding work. And in a number of studies, the turnover is very high. So it could be on the order of 50% per year, meaning half of the people who go into these facilities won't last a year. So that's really something to consider, that if you need a job, but you don't need it so bad that you're going to stay in this environment more than a year. So it's not really a long-term solution for a worker who has to leave. And again, the situation for the workers is like the situation I talked about before for community members. Not all the workers are going to leave. There are differences between people's respiratory systems, their ability, their sensitivity to having their hands or their wrists or their elbows or their shoulders affected by the work in a plant like this. But when a number of these studies were done, the workers were having to cut over 90 birds per minute. And their proposal now is to increase that number and to take out the inspectors and because the inspectors can only go so fast too, and they want to take the inspectors out. This is a new proposal in the federal, the Department of Agriculture, which is causing a lot of concern. So there are clear excess of injuries in this kind of work. It's dangerous work, demanding work, and the injuries are not just acute injuries like cuts, lacerations, but also chronic injuries. So the things that will cause someone to lose her grip strength and no longer can hold things. And actually, this is another type of experience. I've talked with many poultry workers over the years since I became involved in this work. And I've also looked at studies from the federal government as well. As I want to share with you a little bit from what's out there. In 1990, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health evaluated a North Carolina poultry processing facility and found that 36% of the workers had repetitive motion injuries. So these are, you've heard of carpal tunnel syndrome, but there are also various types of tendinitis, other repetitive strain injuries, and injuries to the elbow and shoulder and so on. And 20% had a current disorder based on physical examination. And they reported a turnover rate of 50% annually. Now, my colleague at Duke University, Hester Lipscomb, she's a professor in the medical center. She conducted a study of poultry processing workers in eastern North Carolina. And I took this slide from her. These are her words. And I feel like when I saw this, I said, well, these are good questions to pose to the Nash County Commission. Is this kind of employment good? What does a community gain from a large, low-wage employer with a 50+% turnover rate? Isn't it important for us to know why people are leaving employment? And are workers being used as an expendable commodity? So Dr. Lipscomb asked these questions based on her research. And this slide is just one of from one of a number of publications in the medical literature that came out of this study. It's titled Upper Extremity Musculoskeletal Symptoms and Physical Health-Related Quality of Life Among Women Employed in Poultry Processing and Other Low-Wage Jobs in Northeastern North Carolina. And the group from Duke compared these musculoskeletal symptoms and the physical health-related quality of life in poultry workers with another set of women who were similar, except they worked in other types of jobs. And the results are depicted, some of the results, just one example, depicted here in the lower part of the slide. And I'm reminding myself as a result. Those of you who are closer, maybe you could help me. The low physical health-related quality of life was almost twice as common, was more than twice as common in the poultry workers than in the other women who were similar, except they worked in other types of jobs. And the upper extremity musculoskeletal symptoms, so these would be hand, wrist, arm, elbow, shoulder, so were more than 3 times more common in the poultry workers. And unfortunately, these repetitive motion injuries can last a very long time. And a lot of medical providers recommend surgery for this. But often it doesn't work. And some people can recover from these types of injuries after a long time, but some people don't. And so what's happening in a poultry processing plant is some of the workers are being injured in ways where they won't be able to work. And they will go from being breadwinners and productive members, workers in their community, to being injured in a way that will prevent them from holding a job and really from even fulfilling the family duties that they have, such as caring for their children, not being able to do that. And one of the other findings from the Duke study, one of the other findings from the Duke study is that another problem that isn't seen, that's an excess in poultry workers, is depression. And to me, that makes sense, because if you've been injured in a way that affects your quality of life and your ability to function in your family and to support your family, that could be depressing. So I brought another quote from Dr. Lipscomb because I thought she put it very well. In understanding the contributions of work to health disparities, so this is the gap in health between people in low-income jobs and people who are wealthy. It's not only important for us to understand what happens in workplaces, but also how work sites come to be in certain communities. And this is a question, so she's saying, why do we have so much livestock production in eastern North Carolina? That this is a question that's relevant for our communities. And the way she put it, and she points out, in 1960, there were over 300 commercial suppliers and family farms that supplied birds to the retail market. By 2000, there were less than 50. And Arkansas, Georgia, and North Carolina. Now, what is it about these states? Why aren't these facilities in Massachusetts, in Colorado, in Oregon, in Connecticut? Well, we know historically the South has been the poorest area of the nation. And the South has been a place where people from the rest of the country have come to get cheap labor and cheap land and cheap resources. And Dr. Lipscomb, I think that really that's what she's pointing out here. And she goes on to say that reduction of labor costs occurs through hiring of less advantaged groups, often women, immigrants, non-whites, who are perceived to be less likely to organize and more likely to accept poorer conditions. Southern states have recruited industry, tax breaks, anti-union legislation, permissive regulations, and promises of low wages. So Dr. Lipscomb believes that our state, and this part of the state in particular, that we're being targeted for this industry because we can be taken advantage of. And her studies of injuries and of health-related quality of life and depression symptoms and so on in the poultry processing plants bear out that concern. So I'd like to end my formal presentation with this diagram. And I need to explain it to you because it relates very specifically to Dr. Lipscomb's conclusions about poultry processing and its effects on public health and occupational health. This diagram is called the Circle of Friends. And I want to tell you that I was given a document from which this is one page by a member of a community who asked me never to tell anybody that I got this from her. And it was a packet of material that came from a company called IBP, which stands for Iowa Beef Producers. And in the 1990s, they were trying to locate a slaughterhouse near Rocky Mountain. I'm imagining some of you may remember that. And this document, which was about 12 or 15 pages, had instructions for how the company was going to be able to come into this area and get what they wanted. And they talked about spreading rumors about people who opposed them. And they talked about making friends in the media and with public officials and so on. And the document is really summarized, I think, quite well in this picture, which was right at the front, because they wanted to talk about their circle of friends. These are the people that IBP wanted to enlist to get their way in this area. So in the center, these are the closest to the company. Of course, their staff, and the state staff, and the Edgecombe County business leaders, and the local pork producers, because this could have been a pork processing plant. And these are the people who, of course, stand to gain the most from being able to take advantage of a low-income population where there's a large non-white population that traditionally does not have political power to get better use. Now, in the next circle, moving on, what do we see there? They have the Pork Producers Association, their associate industry association, and local representatives. And they have the local mayors and the county commissioners. And you move out to the next circle, and they have Edgecombe County residents. So they're trying to build support in the more general population. One interesting part of this circle, I think, is they say African American ministers. They don't say ministers. They don't say white ministers. They say African American ministers. Now, why would that be? They, I believe, would see that the impact of this industry would be worse for African Americans because of existing levels of unemployment and poverty, and they believed that they would be better able to convince the black population to support this if they were able to obtain the help of the ministers. And you may know that there are places, many places, where the ministers are given at Christmas time chickens and hams and so on to give to their congregation. And it helps them to be convinced that this business is a friend, or they don't want to lose that, so they won't say anything about the negative impacts. And then in the outside circle, these are not really friends at all. They're the competitors, the other industries. They're activists and organized opposition and fringe citizens. Who's in the outer circle there? Now, this is from the point of view of a corporation that has a very well-paid staff that is focused on promoting their business as a great thing to people like you. And this isn't something that they just do casually. They have studied this. And there are other industries that do this, and there are consulting firms that work with industries to understand the best ways to present what they're doing, not as a way for them to line their pockets and increase their profits, but as something that's good for us. That's their job. You know, they will not survive as a business unless they put their profits first. And that's just the way our system works. It's just being honest. But I think it would be a mistake to think that they are making decisions about how to run their business or pay their workers or protect the workplace or the environment for our well-being. I really don't think that's true. If they were doing that, they would go out of business. So, for me, the woman who gave me this, she was afraid that it would be traced back to her. And the reason she was afraid is because of the power of the industry in her community. Because there were threats, because people might lose their jobs. And these are little people. I mean, so-called. They're not little. But they're people who can't call their lawyer to fix the problem, or can't call their legislator or their representative and have something done. So they have to be careful. But I had never thought about this before. But as I looked through this document, which is summarized in the circle of friends, it helped me to understand the kinds of decision-making that the industry makes when they present their portfolio to you as something that will be good for this area. So I would be happy to answer questions. I'd like for you to think about some of the medical and public health issues, and I do believe they're related very much to this overall big decision. Ultimately, there are economic issues and political issues here as well. And obviously, you face all of those. I have to say I'm glad that I don't face as many difficult decisions that you face. But I guess that's why you're elected, is to deal with these issues. And if I can provide any additional details, I've I believe that Mr. Murphy has already received some of the scientific publications that are the basis of my presentation here. There are a lot more that I could provide if you would be interested. I would also mention, I did try to get someone from Duke, from the medical school there, to come with me today, because I think they really have a great deal of expertise, particularly in the slaughterhouse issue. And I believe they were not able to come on such short notice. But I'm sure that if you were to issue an invitation to Dr. Lipscomb or to one of her colleagues that was involved in the Duke study, I was involved only early on myself, that they would be happy to come and talk with you in more detail about their study of the process.
Dr. Lee, I would just like to be the first one to say thank you for coming and explaining more of this to the people of Nash County and why in the world we're doing, even thinking about a little plant here. I would never know it, but just thank you for your information. It has been very enlightening for a lot of people, to me, I'm sure. It's all anybody else that will listen. It's very enlightening. Thank you again.
You're welcome. A pleasure to be here.
Dr. Wing, I'd like to ask a few questions. I noticed most of what you cited, studies were done north of Maryland, Delaware area. How many studies have been done based on this report here in North Carolina, especially eastern North Carolina?
The studies that I cited of the poultry transport trucks and the flies, they were done in Maryland. Very similar poultry operations there as to what we have here. The studies of the community exposures of the neighbors to the air pollutants from the capos here in North Carolina, the hog operations, they were done here in North Carolina. And the studies of the processing plant are also North Carolina studies.
Well, let's take a look at the health situation that you mentioned about health issues in the community and also in the plant. What's the ratio of health problems working in a poultry processing plant versus health problems in a community where they're not?
Right. Well, we can look to the Duke study for some information on that here in North Carolina. And for the women who work in the processing plant, they had about twice as many, really a bit more than twice as many, I believe 2.4 times as much of the physical health-related quality of life problems. And they had more than 3 times as many of the musculoskeletal symptoms. And these are the problems that develop when you spend day after day, hour after hour, cutting birds or processing birds with similar motions all day long.
In connection with that, has that been compared to people who do other jobs where they're maybe on an 8-hour-a-day in motion? I'm thinking about people sitting at the computer all day. And I know at these poultry plants, they shift them. Maybe they work a couple of hours doing one thing, they shift over to doing something else. Telephone operators, telephone companies, they sit there constantly moving up. Any comparison?
Those are also, they can be hazardous operations. So people who work on computers can develop repetitive motion injuries. You're absolutely right. But if you look at the federal statistics on this, you will see that processing plant work, livestock work, or slaughterhouse workers are considered to be one of the most dangerous jobs. They're not the only jobs that have these kinds of problems, but they have a higher occurrence of these problems than many other industries. And partly it's because it's an assembly line. If you work at a computer, most people who work at a computer, they may have a workstation that will lead to the kinds of problems you're talking about. You're absolutely right. But many times they're able to get up and change or stop for a while and do something else. And if you're on an assembly line, you can't do that because you are at the mercy of that line and the line speed. The line speed is a key issue in the processing plant. One of the recommendations for reducing these injuries is to slow the line speed. But actually right now the proposal is to increase the line speed.
But they do shift, but they don't do the same thing.
And that should help. That should help. But it's still a very high turnover and dangerous work.
Well, when you talk about high turnover, I don't blame people. That's what we do in society. We try to make things better for ourselves and get higher wages. And while we're working on one job, we get training so we can get something, well, make more money. And I think it's the same thing in poultry, in agriculture operation, poultry operation, hog operation, or any other operation. That people move from one level to another level.
People want better jobs and they want higher wages and they want better working conditions. The concern in these poultry processing plants and other processing plants is if they experience injuries that if they may be prevented, they may not be able to get that better job because they're injured. And that clearly happens.
What about you up on treating the water before it goes on the spraying fields to extract chemicals from it, mainly arsenic, as you mentioned?
Okay, so we have two kinds of waste issues here. With the water treatment, that will occur at the processing plant.
Right.
And the processing plant is not like the production facilities. So in the production facilities, if it's poultry, mostly dry litter, it's not treated at all. It's not treated. The arsenic's in it, the antibiotic-resistant bacteria are in it, the irritants, the dust, they just get put out on the fields. There's no treatment. At the processing plant, they will use very large amounts of water. That water will become foul with the guts and the whole processing part, feathers and everything. That will go through a treatment plant, according to the plan that I read. And the water that comes out of the treatment plant, as long as the treatment plant is operating correctly, then that water should not be a huge disposal problem. What I did not see anything about, and here's a question that I would suggest that you ask. There was no mention in the report that I saw about what happens to the sludges. A water treatment plant, whether it's an industrial plant, such as the one proposed here, or a municipal wastewater treatment plant, the water that comes out of this building goes into a drain and it goes to a treatment plant. The water has to be cleaned before it's returned to a stream or a river or a lake. That's a federal requirement. And there are permits issued by the state to do that. But in the process of cleaning the water, there's what's called the sludge, the solids. I did not read anything about what will happen to those solids. And I know people, and we've actually done some studies of people who live around areas where these sludges are applied to land. Now, the sludge we've studied is from a municipal wastewater treatment plant, but this industry's treatment plant will have some similar features. They're trying to clean the water to return. What will happen to the sludge? Will that be put near people's homes? That would be a public health concern.
How would they not?
It is not, it's run back through the plant numerous times enough where they do not accumulate sludge at all in that treatment plant.
Well, they have solids.
They have to dispose of them.
Right, they have to dispose of the solids. So the solids, there are three ways that the solids are disposed of typically. They would be applied to land, they would be put into a landfill, or they would be incinerated. Now, they've got to do something with it because it's got to go somewhere. They do have the solids. That's the whole purpose of the treatment process, is to remove the solids, the bacteria, the organic material, and the inorganic material. And that will have to go somewhere. So that's something that is relevant to this facility. And that's a question that, if I had the opportunity, I would ask.
We've asked, and I'll give you that information in house now.
Thank you.
It doesn't leave the site.
Could it not be hauled off?
Yes.
Because, I mean, I know that, and I don't want you to get my answer because I'm in the dry cleaning business, but I know that we have to pay, ours is hauled off.
Mhm.
We keep it in a fee that the government inspects, comes and they haul it off. So this could very well happen to that it could be put in those same containers and carried to a processing plant where they purify it and do all that stuff.
I would expect exactly that it would be hauled off, and it would either, the majority of the sludge in this country is applied to rural. That is the most common method of disposing of it. But then the next most common methods are incineration and landfill. So those would be at least three of the options, and there may be other options that I'm not aware of. But they're going to have to do something with it, and usually it's hauled off because there's limited facilities to do with it. Like at your business, you can't deal with it yourself.
I'd like to get back to animal waste. Talked about ammonia in the air from animal waste spreading on fields. Is there any research being done how to improve on lessening the ammonia in animal waste when it's used for fertilizer?
You know, I imagine there is. I cannot give you details on the engineering part of that. But animal waste are a problem that are definitely subject of interest because nobody wants to live beside them. That's why we don't have these kinds of facilities in Chapel Hill. We don't have them in Raleigh. We don't have them in areas that are more populated and where wealthier people live. This is why the companies tend to bring these kinds of facilities to lower income areas that have not been able to protect themselves. And it's what is being called environmental injustice.
Would not us being third in the nation with respiratory problems be the consideration that this is partly the cause of all this being third in the nation with respiratory problems?
You know, I don't have direct evidence on it. I think it's very possible. What I think is clear, is even clearer though, is that for a place where people have respiratory problems, and that's known, if you add another air pollutant, it will affect us more than would affect people who don't have as much respiratory problems.
I believe we're third in the nation now with respiratory problems, is that not correct?
I'm not familiar exactly with that figure, but I do know that we have serious respiratory disease problems. That's correct.
I think it's true. We're third in the nation. I believe some of the causes of that being, in fact, respiratory problems being here, I would think, because that's part of the cause of it.
It could be. It could be.
Thank you.
You finished, what's better?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I have some more questions later. I don't need to talk continuously.
I understand. Dr. Wing, I too like to thank you for being here this morning on short notice and bringing us this information. I do want you to leave here though understanding that the information you bring to us is on the industry. A lot of it is in the swine industry rather than the poultry industry, and there are similarities. The challenge of this board in the last 26 months has to take these type items and realize that we're dealing with an industry that has a lot of potential problems. We have to identify those problems, and then we have to look at a specific company that we are recruiting, which in this case happens to be Sanderson Farms. Have you ever spent any time analyzing just one company, or is your research always, in the industry itself, first of all?
It's spread across different countries.
And that's the challenge that we have as elected officials in Nash County, is to take those problems, bring them to the industry or the companies that we are recruiting, and then get the answers how they overcome these problems. And many of the things you have spelled out this morning, in fact, all of them really, we have asked those questions along the way. We have looked at the therapeutic antibiotics. We know Sanderson Farms does not do that. We know that if they're only done by flock when needed, and it's less than 1 in 100 flocks where they do that. We are familiar with the arsenic, but you say it's in the food. We are satisfied that that's not going to be a problem. We take it on one at a time. And I'm glad to hear you say this morning, because we've known this all along, that the processing plant is not the real problem with this industry, or by far not the major problem. It is growing operations. As a board of commissioners, we really aren't charged with the growing operations. We have those anyway. We will not get probably any whatsoever in Nash County, and I'm not isolated enough to look. I do not need to look at the entire area rather than just my county. But to the issues with the growing operations, we have studied at length. We have depended on, of course, the Ag Department of North Carolina State to answer our questions on that. We've had them in many times. We've had our own Ag Extension Agency to provide us with literature, and we know we're not recruiting a perfect company, but we do know that we're recruiting the best company it is in this particular industry. We are satisfied they do the very best they can. You're talking about 50% turnover rate. They're not anywhere near that. In fact, they're less than half of that company-wide, and we would expect that to be here as well. It's just, I don't want you to leave Nash County not thinking that we have done our due diligence on this thing. Do not know how it will turn out. That will probably come to light on Monday. But for 26 months, this board has labored with this, and what we've had an issue getting people to understand is that reports like you've given us here this morning are great information, but all of it is not going to apply to what we're doing with Sanderson Farms. And we are in dire need of jobs. We know that. We all know that. We also know the type of people that we have living in our 3-county area that need jobs. Sometimes they're lack lacking in formal education, and I'm really somewhat ill about the terminology of taking advantage of people. We are not taking advantage of people by providing these type jobs, I don't think at all. If we're going to move our county forward, we're charged to provide jobs that all of our people can do. We can't take the upper educated people and provide those jobs and leave the rest of them behind. It doesn't work like that. We've got to put all these people on the track, and we've got to move forward totally as a community. There are just some of our employees or some of our residents that desperately need jobs. And the times that we have spent, numerous ones of us have been in other areas, and the most touching testimony that I've heard in this whole thing was down in Georgia by the school superintendent in the county where Sanderson Farms has a plant, and to hear him tell what it has done to the families in his county. Now that county is a little forward in Nash County, granted, but to provide 1,100, in his case it was 1,400 jobs, just affected the lifestyle of his total county by putting jobs that their people could do in homes that had never had a paycheck before. And we've got many people in our three-county area that have not had a paycheck in a home before because we've lost our textile industry. That's where these people used to work at. And we've lost a lot of our ag industries. And that's what we're charged to do, is to come up with jobs that we can provide for all of our citizens. And hopefully we have studied this enough that the board is going to make the right decision. I don't know what that decision will be on Monday, but it hasn't been done without a tremendous amount of due diligence. I will assure you of that, and I would like you to leave Nash County knowing we have done that. And again, I appreciate your time, sir.
You're welcome. And Mr. Davis, I would just say, I could tell from the materials that I got from Mr. Murphy that you've traveled out of state, and I'm sure that you've gathered a tremendous amount of information on this. And I understand that takes a lot of time and effort on your part. I guess my question would be, how much of that information comes from Sanderson Farms? And if their job, is to make themselves look good.
I fully understand that and appreciate that comment. And that's why we went to the communities where they were at and got it from the people that were in the communities, not Sanderson, but where they had been a long period of time, and make sure those communities were okay 5 years later, 10 years later, and in some cases 20 years later. We had 9 other communities that we have studied. And that's where we put the information of the how it affects the health and the well-being of communities. That's where we got that information from, not from the company itself. But I appreciate your comment. But they'll excuse me for taking.
No, you need to give everybody time to ask their questions. I don't want to monopolize it. But I'd like to get back to the health issue again. And we've had research information, not from Sanderson Farms. We've had environmental studies. We've had other engineers land for spray field studies and all that. Saul identified that idea for it. So that didn't come from Sanderson Farm. But back to the health issue, I certainly would like to know the ratio of health issues as results of, and I wonder how can you distinguish it out from other bacteria and things in industry versus what's coming from other industries that's in that same act?
Right. Well, that is a great question, because that is a major focus of designing studies, to try and figure out how to isolate what it is that's the problem. So when epidemiology first started, it started actually in England, and they made a map. And they saw that the people who drank water that came from downstream had more cholera than the people who drank water from upstream. They didn't know what it was that was in the water. It took decades to figure out that, and development of microscopes to figure out what it was. But those are the same, and they were up because there are other differences between the people who are downstream and upstream. And that's the same situation that you're referring to. Poultry workers are different than other workers, and people who live around a poultry operation are different than people who live somewhere else. So there are several ways that we try to figure out how to separate those different factors. So one way is to match people. If you have an older woman here, you have an older woman here. You have a younger man here, you have a younger man here. So that you can hold that constant. There's not going to be an age difference or a sex difference between the two groups. And that's a very standard way, and the studies that I have brought to you use that method. Some of them use that method. Then another method that we use is to look for what it is that's in the pollutants, because those constituents have been studied other places, and they can even be studied in animals. And then we can see, are the constituents that we already know that cause a respiratory problem or a neurologic problem, whatever it is that what's in the things that people are exposed to? And then the third method that was the method we used, the primary method we used in the study that I spoke about earlier, was we followed people over time. So we could see if they were different at the times when the pollution is present from at the times when there was no pollution. So for example, every day, twice a day, people took their blood pressure using one of those automated cuffs, and they printed out the results. We gave them each a printer so they could print out their systolic blood pressure and their diastolic blood pressure and the time it was taken and so on. We linked that to the air pollution measures that we took in their neighborhood. And we found that when the air pollution was higher, their blood pressure was higher. When the air pollution was lower, the blood pressure was lower. Now, this is the same person. It's not like the person has a different diet or a different job or a different family history. They're the same person. So what we were able to see is that the exposure can track with the blood pressure. And that's a way to say it's got to be the exposure, because all the other things about the person are staying the same over time.
Well, to make it kind of accurate, though, what I'm driving at is we need to know what effect, that problem, the situation that you described, how much of that is caused by the pollution that's coming from processing plants or from the poultry houses or the spray fields. And if we don't know that, then we can tag the poultry operation as the source. It's part of the source.
And I would just very quickly respond that all we can do is our we use the methods that we can to try and make a conclusion. And I would agree with you that all evidence can be challenged. There's always a question you can raise. But at some point, we have to make decisions about what to do. And I can just share with you my conclusion based on our work and the work of others that I've reviewed, is that I believe there is very good evidence that these air pollutants negatively impact people's health. Now, there's possible some other explanation. I cannot completely rule it out in every case. But I would say there's enough evidence so that it would be just like London in 1848, when they said, we have enough evidence, we should clean up the water supply to stop these epidemics.
Well, I believe we, here in America, we are smart enough with technology that we have, that we can do that without driving it. We just haven't done it.
We haven't done it. I would agree with that.
And with that, I will let it be done. I learned a few things today. Some I already knew. And it's always good to gain knowledge. I'm the type of person that I like to grow in knowledge. And thank you for coming.
Dr. Wing, I would like to ask you one more question while you're going on. I feel like Dr. Wing is much more qualified than any of us to answer this question as to where this thing has come from. He's done this overnight. He's done it with fellows, has the ability and the know-how, and the people that have done this studies are well qualified to show. And why are we bringing something here that has the potential to harm Nash County people and assets? Not good. Liabilities far exceed the assets. Why are we doing it at all? If there's a chance in any way of anybody knowing that it is harmful to Nash County people, we should not be coming here, period. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, there's a question.
Excuse me, Mr. Ballard.
Thank you. Steve, I also want to thank you for being here. I appreciate the information that you provide. I've got a couple of questions and I've got a couple of comments. This is a subject that we've been talking about for well over 2 years. I believe that it has divided our county. It's divided our region. It has even divided this board to the point where I don't know that we will ever be able to have the same relationship with each other. It's an emotional issue. I'm trying to keep my emotions out of it and deal with facts and common sense. So in that vein, I want to make a couple of comments relative to what Mr. Davis said, and then I want to ask you a couple of questions. Mr. Davis, and I'm paraphrasing, he said we would not get any more CAFOs in Nash County. I hear that all the time. But as recently as this week, this board received, at least I received, an updated financial impact analysis document that clearly states that there will be 45 CAFOs placed in the three-county region, Nash, Edgecombe, and Wilson. So do the math. These are large CAFOs. They're not 2 houses. They're typically 8, maybe 10 houses. So if you do 45 times 8 or 10, and then divide that by 3, we're going to get our part of that. And we know that a larger concentration of animals is going to lead to a more prominent odor. I believe that to be the case. So I make that point, and if you question that point, then I refer you back to your financial impact analysis document. Mr. Davis stated that the turnover rate, the employee turnover rate with Sanderson, and you know we talk about Sanderson is such a great company. Would a great company do what they are allowing to happen in this region? I think not. I visited Moultrie, Georgia. I didn't go down on the company jet. I drove down. I took my wife. I visited the area. I toured the plant. I asked what I refer to as the plant manager specifically, what is the turnover rate for this plant? He replied to me, the turnover rate for this plant is approaching 50%. And when people leave, we do not ever rehire them. Now, that tells me that eventually you're going to exhaust the workforce that is willing to work in a business such as this. Now, I support the loss of the employees by the next statement I'm going to make. I visited Sanderson Farms plant in Siler City. I had a friend up there. He set me up. I went up with another friend. We visited that plant. I asked him, I said, what are the demographics of this plant? They had a high turnover rate, a high unemployment rate just like us. He said, I'm a farmer. This is my life. This is what I do. I support this business. But the people in this area will not work in this plant. Therefore, we have 80% of our workforce has been brought in here. Now, there's two things I don't do, not intentionally. I don't lie and I don't cheat. And I'm telling you straight what was told to me. The bottom line is that Sanderson is like any other business. I worked at Abbott Laboratories for 31 plus years. Any business is going to do what they've got to do to make sure that their bottom line is as good as it can be. They have a responsibility to their stockholders to do that. Now, I also went out in the community in Moultrie. And I personally went and visited with a realtor. And I said, what is the impact of Sanderson Farms on this area? Moultrie, Georgia is a beautiful little town. It's separated away from the site several miles. In the location of the processing plant, an upscale home there, she told me was $50,000 to $60,000. And it had devastated the value of the properties in and around that area. Now, I asked her, I said, would you be willing to make a trip to Rocky Mountain to speak before our board if I pay your way? She said, absolutely. But since that trip, she has gone underground. She won't talk. I've had realtors, I've had construction people and others pull me aside in the community, in the church, and say to me, Wayne, keep fighting the good fight. Do not buckle under the pressure to bring Sanderson Farms to Nash County. In the long run, it will not be good for our county. I think one other thing I want to mention on Sanderson Farms, we spent a whole day in here listening to pro-chicken. I think you're the first person that's ever really been brought in here to speak to us that had any views that countered any of the pro-chicken opinions. I asked for a lot of information from Pick Billingsley on that day. I've never asked for it since, and I've never received it. Now, there may be some on this board that know what the demographics are and the turnover rates are at the various plants, but I don't know, because it's never been provided. Never been provided. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. I'm referring to an article in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine, Musculoskeletal Symptoms Among Poultry Processing Workers and Community Comparison Group, Black Women in Low-Wage Jobs in the Rural South. The conclusion seems to be that the poultry industry wants to locate in rurally, economically depressed communities and typically employ black women and immigrant workers to do the work. Is that a fair assessment of what I heard you say today?
That is.
Okay.
I agree.
Is there evidence of that, other than you saying it in this report?
Well, the report that you cite is a very systematic assessment of evidence because it is based on research involving women who reported their race, their ethnicity, and so on. And to be honest, if you go to the communities, as you did, you just spoke about Solid City, which is near where I live, the demographics are pretty evident. You don't have to be a researcher.
And look, just I don't know if any of you have ever been to Solid City. That was an older plant. Grant, I'll give you that. But there were days in Solid City when the stench from that plant was just unbearable. Now let me ask you another question. In another article published in 2009 in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine, upper extremity musculoskeletal symptoms and physical health-related quality of life among women employed in poultry processing and other low-wage jobs in northeastern North Carolina, the conclusion stated, physical health-related quality of life among young women employed in poultry processing was what would be expected among women 15 years their senior. Do you agree?
That's the finding of that study, and basically you could call it a kind of accelerated aging. These could be arthritic conditions or conditions related to tendinitis, other repetitive motion problems. And, you know, I can say, having talked with poultry workers at some of these plants, that you can have the statistics, and that's what I work with, and to be honest, you know, that's my job. But I also think it's important to hear people's stories. And I can tell you that that poultry processing plants in some areas have recruited workers who are teenagers. Some of them will drop out of high school. They need to get a car to get to work. They take the job. They have a car payment. They can't leave the job because they have to make that payment. And therefore, many of them end up getting injured in the way that this research has shown. And it makes them seem like they're much older than they are, because many of these are young women and they're having problems that would be more typical of a much older person.
Mr. Belville asked a question or made a statement that regarding turnover, that in many cases people just want to do better. And I absolutely agree with that. In many cases they do want to do better. But if we actually could receive the facts from Sanderson, which was asked for in terms of safety rates and the incident rates, that sort of thing. We might can make that comparison, but we can't. But your data supports that turnover is in large part due to public health and safety. And I'll tell you, if you ever go in a poultry plant and watch it in operation, you'd understand why an old man like me could not work in a plant like that. It's just too intense, very, very intense. You spoke to injuries and turnover rates. Do your studies reveal any internal work cultures in poultry processing facilities where the employees are actually reluctant to report the accidents for fear of repercussions?
That is an important problem. When we conduct research, we depend on being able to, what we call, count cases. People who have the injury or the disease that we're studying. And there are two problems in these processing plants. One is that if you report a problem or if you lay out of work, you would be worried about losing your job. And then we would not be able to count that problem happened. The second is that some of the plants have medical departments. So the CAFOs, the growing facilities don't. But the slaughterhouses, many of them have a medical department. That medical department is run by the report injuries. They would call the attention of the authorities. They could potentially get into problems. So they're very reluctant to report that anything is caused by the work. So they would often tell the worker, take aspirin and go back, or this sort of thing, or your problem is due to something else. So they're both self-imposed reasons for fear, as well as problems with a clinic that is controlled by the employer who is seeking to maximize profits where the injuries could be inflicted.
And I've worked in the industry for over 31 years, and in a manufacturing operation, and from my perspective and my position in the company, I've seen that exact same thing. I know they won't keep the incident rates down. Are you familiar with ILOs? Are you familiar with that term?
Well, I know two things that I would call it here in North Carolina: intensive livestock operation or intensive livestock ordinance. Those are, I don't know if you were referring to one of those, but an operation would be like a CAFO, like a feeding operation. An ordinance would be something that a county would adopt to try and protect its citizens from injury or pollution.
Well, I'm ashamed to say that as I sit here today, that we're over 2 years into this thing, and I only this week took the time to review the ILO that we used to have on the books, which was removed in 2010. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have that expertise, but I read that ILO, and I want to tell you, just for those of you that are not familiar with it, I'm going to share some of the requirements that were listed in that ILO. It required an approved waste management plan, which addressed carcass disposal, truck and equipment washdown, and other waste management practices. It required threshold levels for animals. It required permits that must be in conformance with must be in conformance with the existing state laws and rules. And one of the things that was common throughout that ILO was must be in conformance with existing state laws and rules. I think that's why it was removed, because there was fear of legal action because the state laws took precedence over the county. These existing state laws and rules included construction of a new or expanded ILO, specifically stating in the ILO that in the case of expanded ILOs, a construction permit shall only be issued after certification by the Nash County Health Department that the amended waste management plan, siting and design criteria meet state laws and rules. That seems like some pretty good stuff to me. I know we go into our restaurants and we try to make sure that they stay on task, and seems like we were trying to do the same thing here. It required a facility closure plan if an ILO was going to cease operations. It required facility inspections by the Nash County Health Department prior to issuing permits, and at least an annual inspection. And listen to this, it required a livestock advisory committee consisting of not less than 5 members, of which 3 would be ILO owners or operators. Now, I said all that to say this. We don't have an ILO now. I don't know that many counties in the state do, if any. But based on what you've heard about our ILO, and I know you're not a lawyer either, but do you think they are pretty reasonable things that I just called out for a county to be concerned about and be involved in?
Yes, they are very reasonable things to be concerned about. What's exactly adequate is another question, but they are.
Or do you think that what we should do, we've got 90 to 100 houses in Nash County now, and I might want to make sure you understand they're not as large, concentrated houses like these CAFOs would be from Sanderson Farms, but what we've got now is we just allow a grower to contract with Sanderson. They borrow their own money. This is the way I understand it. The houses are built. They start their operation. They have a waste management plan. The plan is never really submitted. Nobody ever really comes and reviews the operation, inspects the operation until you have a problem. Now, that leads me to the next question. How did we get into the problems we got in with the swine industry? Is it because we had a similar setup from the state in controlling these operations before all these issues came to light that we got now with the poultry industry? And are we going to let history repeat itself by having the issues that we previously had with swine before we decide that we're going to do something about it? And by that time, all the fanfare with Sanderson in this area, all the money's been made, all the houses have been built, and we're left with what we're left with. What's your opinion of that?
I think we are in danger of repeating history, and it's not a pretty picture.
If there's anything we ever do, is we don't learn from history.
I think that there's been a very close relationship between this industry and the people in government who have regulated it. When I started, I said earlier that some of these studies we have evidence from around swine operations, but not around poultry operations. Well, when I started this work, when the group of us at Chapel Hill started this work, we saw that there were a number of studies that had been done by state universities in the swine industry. They were studies of animal nutrition, of veterinary practices, of waste management, of animal breeding, but there were no studies of the impacts on the workers or the people who live nearby. So that's a sign to me that our universities and our government have been enlisted to support this industry without engaging the concerns about public health that we're here to talk about today. And I fear that that could happen again. It has happened to some degree with poultry. And one of the issues with poultry that I think is very important that affects our research actually is whereas swine operations hold permits from the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources, where we can find out where they are, how many animals they have, how many acres are permitted for waste application, the sizes of their manure holding pools. All of that's in the state records. Then none of that is available for poultry operations. We cannot even determine their location.
Well, I've asked for their locations from our county, and that information is not available.
So this speaks to the fact that even the information that we would need that would help us understand the health impacts is systematically not available. And I believe that's a problem. The lack of permitting, the lack of, because these are industries, these are not farms in the sense of what we understand to be a farm that our, the generations before us have.
Well, I'm gonna just shut up and say one final thing, and then we're gonna move forward to Monday, and this board's gonna do what it's gonna do. But I think that we would be very wise to pause, slow down. We've got an inducement package with Sanderson Farms. They haven't committed to anything in the short term. I don't really understand what the rush is, but I think we should pause. I think we should slow down. And I believe you would advise this board to do this if we asked you what your recommendation was. And I think we should do, for one thing, a complete and thorough public health and safety evaluation incorporating entities that would be non-biased and would give us the information as it is. And then I also think we would be wise to reinstate our ILO. I'm not looking at applause. I'm just saying what's on my mind. What?
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, if you got something to say, say it.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think the ILO should be reinstated, consistent and compliant with state law. And if there was anything in it that was not consistent and compliant, all we did was we threw out the baby with the washer. We should have looked at it, we should have revised it appropriately, and we should have kept it in place. And I think we should revisit that, and we should put it back in place. And if that means that Sanderson Farms cannot live within those restrictions, well, Purdue does. Others do. What makes Sanderson Farms so much different from those people? I thank you again for being here. I trust that your comments, your information, your expertise, I just pray. I pray about this a lot. And everybody now talks about God and praying. But I pray, I believe, and I pray about this a lot. And I just pray that this board will not approve this inducement package on Monday.
I might make one comment on this. I believe at the time, correct me if I'm wrong, David, I think that was one of their requests for Sanderson Farms to come, that this ILO get done away with prior to the time. That was one of the requirements for them to come in here, to do away with ILO. That's all I have to say.
Mr. Chairman, if there are no other comments or questions, I would request that the board consider